Frank in Buffalo. Hey, Frank, what's on your mind today?
Thanks for taking my call, and I say that because I told your screener I generally disagree with you.
Yeah, that's why I took you first. I always take people who disagree with me before anybody else.
I appreciate that. I do appreciate the fact that you make sensible arguments that I tend to disagree with, and I don't dislike you or anything by any means, and I enjoy listening to your show.
Well, thank you.
I'm a little confused. Here comes the but.
Sure.
The voter ID card thing.
Yeah.
When I go to vote, I'm in New York State.
Right.
I walk in, I just say, I'm Frank. They flip open the book, I sign my name, and I walk in and I vote. And I've always thought to myself, what if some John Schmo, whoever from the street, comes walking in and says, hey, I'm Frank, and he signed his name before I get there, and he walks in and votes.
Right.
I don't understand why there's no security there for something that's so important to me.
Okay, well, let me try to explain it. And I think if you are genuinely open-minded, I'm hopeful that at the end of this conversation you will agree with me. The way that we make decisions in this country with regard to things that can be harmful, and you and I both agree that people fraudulently voting is harmful. We're agreed on that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So the way that we make decisions about things that might be harmful, for example, a pesticide or a new chemical that's going to be used as a plasticizer, that might show up in baby food bottles or something like that. The way we make that decision, or pollution in the air. How much mercury should we allow in the air? How much mercury can a coal-fired power plant pump out into the air? Is what's called a cost-benefit ratio. In other words, we look at it and we say, okay, it's going to cost us to eliminate the first 99% of the mercury in the air. It's going to cost $100, per ton. But to get that last percent, it's going to cost $5,000 per ton. And the benefit that we get is certainly worth the $100 per ton for the 99%. But for that last 1%, that benefit is going to just be such a small number of people who are going to be poisoned by that mercury that we're going to allow it into the air. Are you with me on this?
Yeah, I get the point. So
I don't like the way that we do our cost-benefit ratios. I disagree with a lot of them. Mercury is one of the ones that I disagree with. But that's how we do it on pretty much everything. We always, literally on everything we do, you and I, if we decide, we're going to drive someplace, cost-benefit. Is it going to be worth the time, the effort, the cost of gasoline? Do I hitchhike? Pretty much every decision we make in our lives boils down to, at the end of the day, some sort of a cost-benefit analysis. So knowing as we do, since the George W. Bush administration spent 7 years and $74 million having 93 federal prosecutors devote most of their time to looking for fraudulent voting, knowing as we do that nationally there are fewer than 100 cases, in fact, actually last year it was 13, fewer than 100 cases of people who are illegally voting. And the vast majority of those are spouses of people who have Alzheimer's, spouses of people with whom they disagree politically or from whom they are separated, or people who are felons who are trying to vote in a state where felons are not allowed to vote and they didn't realize that that was the law. And because no felon would, go in and say, hi, I'm here to vote illegally, because if you do as a felon, they send you back to jail, right? You lose your parole. So we're talking about fewer than 100 people nationwide out of over 150 million of us who are eligible to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's a good explanation. I've
right.
never heard it that way before.
So why are we willing to pass laws that are so draconian that in the state of Wisconsin, for example, 750,000 people are not going to be able to vote because they don't have a driver's license? That would be older people who have, no longer have the ability to drive. It would be students who don't need to drive. They're living with their parents or they're living on campus. It would be poor people who never were able to get enough money to buy a car. People who live in cities, in big cities with good public transportation system. I don't own a car, for example. I live here in Washington, D.C. I take the metro everywhere. So all of those people, all those constituencies I just described, old people, students, poor people, people who live in big cities, tend to vote Democratic. So the Republican Party comes along and they say we're going to knock 700,000 people off the voting rolls just in one state, 5.6 billion people nationally, and these are conservative numbers. These are the numbers that the Republicans will acknowledge. We're going to knock 5.5 million people off the voting rolls in order to stop 100 people from voting illegally, and it probably won't stop those 100 people anyway, because most of the vast majority of the voter fraud that they found and prosecuted during the 7 years of the Bush administration was focused on that, and this is why those 7 federal prosecutors quit their jobs. Remember when that happened? Because they said, I want to go after criminals rather than voter fraud. Yeah, during that 7 years, the vast majority of those people that they busted did it with absentee ballots. And you don't show ID with an absentee ballot. So it wouldn't even solve that problem.
Your argument sold me. One thing I'll throw back at you, that could they just make it, maybe instead of driver's license, most people have some sort of ID, any ID.
Yeah.
Basically just some ID.
Well, it's always been that way in every state. I remember the very first time that I voted. It was in Michigan. I was shortly after I turned 18. The voting age had been dropped by constitutional amendment, and I went in and I had to show my rent. It was a rent receipt or it was a utility receipt. And hang on just a second here. Riverside just threw a window up at me. I got to close it. And I had to see. Here's proof that I live here. And at the time there was no concern about are you in America? I mean, it's like, what foreigner wants to vote in the United States? People who are here illegally are trying to hide from the federal government. They're not going to go say, hi, here I am, let me vote. I mean, they're not crazy. So
those are great points. I agree with you after listening to it, and so I'm glad you told me that.
Okay, thank you, Frank.
One other thing.
Okay,
because a lot about the Romney is that he's a billionaire, all right? And
he's a quarter billionaire, a third of a billionaire.
All these guys. I just looked at the list of the richest top 10 people in Congress, and I mean, 7 out of 10 of them are Democrats, but that's not what I care. It's just they all seem to be. All those guys are millionaires. Right? Can they even understand what we go through as regular citizens when they're all worth 15, 20, 65, 85, 110 million? John Kerry ran for president, and it didn't seem that he's worth 194 million. I mean, wasn't Kennedy from Boston another rich billionaire?
Yeah, Franklin Roosevelt was a rich guy.
And then another one, yes, absolutely. And it just seems to me that is rich bad, is my question.
I don't think so. I'm not opposed to people being rich. The thing that I'm concerned about, and Thomas Jefferson wrote about this at some length, and you can find the quotes fairly easily, is if rich people are allowed to use their riches to corrupt the small d democratic process in our small r republic. And when that happens, then you have a special interest group, rich people, that has the ability to modify elections in ways that don't necessarily work in the best interests of the nation. And I don't think that that's right. I am, the Senate traditionally was called the Millionaires Club, but virtually everybody in the Senate was a millionaire. Sherrod Brown isn't, Bernie Sanders isn't. There's a few of them who are not, but virtually everybody in the Senate is a millionaire. This last election, the 2010 election, was the first time in history that more than half of the House of Representatives members had a net worth of over $1 million, and that's because virtually all, I think it was all, but there might be a couple of exceptions, of the Tea Party candidates who came in were all millionaires. They all had a fairly high net worth, and there was like some 83 of them or something like that got elected.
Would that be an argument for term limits, Tom?
No, we have term limits. They're called elections, and the reason why I'm opposed to term limits is, and I can tell you, living here in Washington D.C. has really opened my eyes to this. When somebody comes into Congress and they don't have a clue what's going on, and they're just thrown into the mix, they look around and they say, "Somebody tell me how this thing works. How do you make laws? How do you do a bill? Hold my hand. Teach me how this works." And if there's not somebody who's been there for 5, 10, 15, 20 years who has some kind of institutional memory, then they're going to find that person, right? They're going to find somebody who knows how it's done. And increasingly, as Congress gets turned over faster and faster and faster, and in fact, this is the thing you've seen with the Tea Partiers, most of these Tea Partiers are now taking big money from the lobbyists. The lobbyists have become the permanent infrastructure in Washington, D.C. And in states where you have term limits, you find that the lobbyists end up having enormously more power in those states where there's term limits than they do in states where there aren't, because the only institutional memory that exists, that survives the term limits, are the lobbyists. And I don't think that that's a good thing. And there's lobbyists on, whether it's the Sierra Club or whether it's ExxonMobil. I don't think that they should be the permanent infrastructure. Have we agreed again, Frank?
Nice conversation. I'll continue to listen.
Okay, good talking with you. Thanks for calling. We need more Republicans like you, Frank.